My hands, calloused from years of coaxing life back into forgotten objects, moved with a practiced rhythm. Each brush, each bottle of solvent, each delicate pick had its designated place in the custom-built trunk. I was Reed, and order was my religion. In a world of chaos, the precise alignment of a tool, the careful restoration of a chipped porcelain vase, these were my anchors. My small apartment, usually a sanctuary of quiet focus, felt temporarily disrupted by the prospect of packing. Not for a client, not for a temporary project, but for something far grander and unsettlingly permanent. The solicitor's voice had been a low drone over the phone, a dry recitation of legal terms about a distant relative I barely remembered, a great-aunt twice removed, whose passing had left me the sole inheritor of a property I hadn't known existed. A manor, he'd called it, isolated, vast, decaying. The words had resonated with a peculiar chill, like old brass catching a draft. It wasn't the kind of inheritance one celebrated. It felt more like a summons. I drove for hours, the hum of the engine a monotonous counterpoint to the silence of the landscape. The familiar suburban sprawl gave way to rolling fields, then dense, ancient woodland that pressed in on either side of the narrow, crumbling road. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, seemed to descend with each mile I covered, swallowing the last vestiges of the sun. My determination, a constant, sharp edge in my personality, was beginning to fray at the edges, replaced by a nascent unease. Finally, the trees parted, and there it was. The manor house. It didn't loom, it squatted. A hulking skeletal silhouette against the dying light, its numerous gables and turrets like jagged teeth biting at the sky. Blackened ivy, thick as a man's arm, wrestled with the crumbling brickwork, a silent, relentless siege. The drive, once probably a grand sweep of gravel, was now a choked path of weeds and broken flagstones, swallowed by centuries of neglect. A wrought-iron gate, rusted into immobility, sagged on a single hinge, its intricate scrollwork a mockery of forgotten elegance. I cut the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute, pressing in on my ears so profound it almost hummed. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight. This wasn't just old, it was ancient, burdened by time and something heavier. My gaze drifted across the facade, noting the intricate, yet eroded carvings above a particularly tall, narrow window on the second floor. A flash, sudden and disorienting, ripped through my vision. For a split second, the manor's imposing stone walls dissolved, replaced by towering gray concrete. The overgrown yard vanished, becoming a stark, barren patch of mud. I saw not the manor, but a high, unforgiving wall, topped with barbed wire, receding into an impenetrable prison yard in thick fog. The air tasted of metal and despair. The silence was not the manor's ancient quiet, but a suffocating, manufactured stillness, broken only by the drip of unseen moisture and the distant, metallic clang of something heavy. Then, just as quickly, the illusion dissolved, leaving me blinking at the familiar, decaying manor. My breath caught in my throat. What was that? A trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my perception. I shook my head, trying to dislodge the lingering image, the metallic tang on my tongue. It felt utterly alien, yet disturbingly real, as though a piece of some other terrible place had momentarily bled into my own reality. I drew a shaky breath, forcing the phantom vision away. This was the manor. This was my inheritance. My determination, though momentarily shaken, resurfaced. I had a job to do. I was an antique restorer. I brought beauty back from the brink of ruin. This house, however daunting, was just a very large, very neglected project. Stepping out of the car, I felt the crunch of dead leaves beneath my boots. A heavy iron knocker, shaped like a grotesque gargoyle, hung askew. I didn't bother with it. With a final, resistant click, the mechanism gave way. I pushed the door inward. A gust of stale, frigid air, thick with the scent of dust, mildew, and something else, something indefinable, ancient and faintly metallic, rushed out to greet me. It felt less like an entrance and more like a sigh. My heart gave a little lurch, a sudden, unfamiliar flutter of apprehension. I stepped across the threshold into the absolute gloom, and the massive door swung shut behind me with a soft, final thud. My custom-built trunk, a testament to years of careful curation, gleamed under the weak light filtering through the dust-streaked windows of the manor's grand study. This was the room I'd chosen to begin. Its massive oak desk, scarred by generations of forgotten hands, dominated the space. The air hung thick with the scent of decaying paper and something else, something metallic and cold like old blood, though I dismissed it as merely the smell of aged iron from the desk's ornate hardware. I was Reed, and my work was a sanctuary. I laid out my instruments, a set of miniature chisels, fine-tipped brushes, bottles of solvent, and polishing compounds. Each item settled into its designated spot on the protective felt I'd spread over the desk's surface. My hands, accustomed to the delicate dance of restoration, found their rhythm immediately. I began with a small, intricately carved wooden box I'd found tucked away in one of the desk's drawers, a test piece, a gentle introduction to the manor's secrets. The first few hours passed in a meditative haze. The scraping of my chisel against the hardened grime, the whisper of a brush, the quiet hiss of solvent evaporating, these were the only sounds in the vast, echoing house. I reached for my smallest micro-scraper, a needle-thin tool I'd fashioned myself for such precise tasks. It wasn't in its usual slot. A faint frown touched my brow. I prided myself on my organization. Every tool had its place. I scanned the felt, then the surrounding desk surface. Nothing. My gaze drifted to the floor, then back to the trunk. I felt a flicker of annoyance, a tiny crack in my carefully constructed order. Perhaps I'd put it back absent-mindedly. I checked the trunk, running my fingers over the custom-cut foam inserts. It wasn't there. Then I saw it. Resting on the very edge of the desk, perilously close to the floor, was the scraper. It lay not in the neat row with its brethren, but perpendicular to them, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. I picked it up, a prickle of unease brushing against my resolve. My memory was sharp. I hadn't left it there. I must have. The mind plays tricks in solitude, I told myself, slipping the tool back into its proper place. The incident was minor, easily dismissed, yet it lingered, a faint discord in the symphony of my work. I heard it then, a faint dragging sound from upstairs, like something heavy being pulled across bare floorboards. It stopped as suddenly as it began. I froze, my hand hovering over the wooden box, expectant. I listened intently, my breath held. Just the slow creak of old timbers, the sigh of the wind through broken panes somewhere upstairs. I told myself it was the house merely settling. Old houses groan, but the sound had been distinct, too deliberate to be a natural settling. I resumed my work, trying to recapture my earlier focus, but the edges of my concentration felt frayed. It was like standing in a vast, empty room, yet knowing I weren't truly alone. A sudden, sharp, metallic clang echoed from somewhere deep within the manor, followed by a rush of cold air that raised goosebumps on my arms. It felt like a door slamming shut far away in the forgotten depths of the cellar or an unused wing. And then it hit me. Not a sound, not a sight, but a complete, terrifying shift in my perception. The study walls, the familiar scent of old wood and solvent, all dissolved. I was no longer in the manor. I was standing on rough, uneven ground, the air thick and cloying, tasting of damp earth and something acrid metallic. A dense gray blanket of mist swirled around me, clinging to my clothes, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. I could hear distant guttural shouts, the clatter of heavy boots on stone, the metallic scrape of gates. I was in a prison yard in thick fog. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shouts grew louder, closer, echoing unnaturally in the dense fog. I felt a desperate urge to run, to hide, but my legs were leaden. Then, as suddenly as it had arrived, the vision vanished. The study walls solidified around me. The scent of old paper returned. The wooden box was still beneath my trembling fingers. I was back. My hands were shaking, a tremor that ran through my entire body. What was that? A hallucination. A trick of the light and the mind, exacerbated by the isolation. I gripped the edge of the desk, trying to ground myself. My meticulous order, my carefully constructed reality, felt fragile, permeable. The house was not merely old, it was alive, and it was beginning to chip away at me, piece by agonizing piece. But in this house, order felt like a prayer whispered into a void, unheard, unanswered, and increasingly unprotected. I was alone, yes, but the house was not empty. And whatever was here, it knew I was watching, and it was watching me back. The air in the grand study hung thick and still, tasting of settled dust and generations of forgotten secrets. It was a dry, brittle scent, like ancient paper crumbling in a forgotten drawer. My custom-built trunk, a testament to years of careful curation, gleamed under the weak light filtering through the dust-streaked windows. Its massive oak desk, scarred by generations of forgotten hands, dominated the space, a silent sentinel of the manor's past. I ran a gloved hand over the desk's surface, feeling the ridges and valleys of its age. My fingers traced the faint, almost invisible etchings of initials, some so worn they were mere shadows. This wasn't just furniture, it was a chronicle. I unpacked my tools, scalpels with surgical precision, brushes softer than a whisper, tiny vials of solvents, and magnifying loupes that brought the microscopic world into stark relief. Each instrument was an extension of my will, designed to coax beauty from decay, to restore what time had stolen. I began with the desk's central drawer, carefully prying it open. The wood groaned, a low, complaining sound as if protesting its disturbance. Inside, only a few desiccated leaves and a scattering of insect husks remained. I worked methodically, cleaning, polishing, assessing. My eyes, trained over decades, scanned for anomalies, for the subtle shifts in grain or the faint lines of a concealed seam. It was a dance between observation and intuition, a quiet conversation with the object itself. My gaze drifted to the side panel of the desk, just beneath the main surface. The wood there seemed to bulge almost imperceptibly, a slight distortion that most would dismiss as warp from damp or age. It was too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. My pulse quickened, a low thrum against my ribs. I retrieved a fine-tipped probe from my kit. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, I inserted the tip into the pinprick. A section of the desk, no larger than my hand, slid inward with a soft sigh of displaced air, revealing a shallow, narrow compartment. My breath hitched. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, leather-bound journal. No title, no author, just the stark, unadorned leather. The clasp, a tarnished brass buckle, was simple, elegant. I unlatched it, the metal groaning softly. The pages were thick, handmade, and brittle with age. The ink, faded to a sepia tone, was in a looping, elegant script. I held it carefully, the scent of old paper and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid rising from its depths. I began to read, my eyes straining in the dim light. The entries were sporadic, undated, and often cryptic. I look at the face in the glass, and it is not my own, the fields around the house. They are not fields, they are waiting mouths, and the children. Oh, the children. Their laughter is a lie. The steward, he knows. He always knows. He guards the gate, but what good is a gate when the walls themselves breathe? Another entry, even more fragmented, sent a shiver down my spine. The fog, it comes for the mind first, blurs the edges. What was my mother's name? I cannot recall. The faces of those I loved, they shift, become strangers. This is not the forgetting of age. This is a taking. And I saw it in the deepest part of the night. It was the absence of light, the absence of self in the prison yard in thick fog. Why did I see that? I have never been there. It felt real, more real than my own hands. I paused, the journal resting heavy in my hands. The words prison yard in thick fog echoed in my mind, a jarring, alien image. Why would that be written here, and why did it feel so vivid? A sudden, sharp pang shot through my skull, a brief, disorienting flicker. For a moment, the study seemed to swim, the oak desk blurring into an indistinct mass. I blinked, rubbing my temples. Stress, I murmured aloud, the sound thin and reedy in the quiet room. Too much isolation, too much dust. I tried to recall what I'd had for breakfast. Oatmeal, yes, with berries, or was it just plain? The detail eluded me, a tiny, annoying blank spot. I shook my head, dismissing it. My focus returned to the journal. The writer's descent into confusion was palpable, their fear of losing their identity almost leaping from the page. I continued to read, absorbing the fragmented history. The entry spoke of a ritual of binding, of a sacrifice of memory to keep something at bay. The manor itself was mentioned repeatedly, not as a structure, but as a living, breathing entity, a cage for something ancient and malevolent. It has taken my face. I am only a vessel. Do not seek the truth. Let it sleep. For to awaken it is to become it. The last page was blank. I closed the journal, the brass clasp clicking shut with a finality that resonated through the room. My hands were trembling slightly. The subtle memory lapse, the inexplicable image of a prison yard in thick fog. They were just fatigue, surely. My mind was playing tricks, primed by the unsettling narrative of the journal. I was an antique restorer, a man of logic and meticulous detail, not a teller of ghost stories. Yet, a seed of unease had been planted. The words of the unknown writer, their desperate fear of losing themselves, felt uncomfortably close. The manor, once just a project, now felt like a presence, watching, waiting. And I, Reed, felt a faint, unsettling whisper at the edges of my own identity, a quiet erosion just beginning. The journal lay on the table, a closed mouth guarding its secrets. The brass clasp had clicked shut with an unnerving finality, and the chill in the air felt less like the old house's drafts and more like a presence. That fleeting image, the one I couldn't shake, the bleak expanse of a prison yard in thick fog, it had come and gone like a phantom limb, leaving behind a faint ache of unease. I told myself it was fatigue, the strain of the restoration, the sheer weight of this decaying manor. But the tremor in my hands was real, and the memory lapse, however brief, was unsettling. I couldn't just leave it. The instinct to understand, to catalog, to restore the truth was too strong. The next morning, fueled by strong coffee and a resolve that felt increasingly brittle, I began my true excavation. The manor's own library, a dusty, neglected wing I hadn't fully tackled yet, became my first target. Shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten histories, local gazettes and leather-bound ledgers. Hours blurred into a single, extended vigil. I sifted through brittle pages, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood, though I knew it was just imagination. The records were fragmented, maddeningly vague. I found references to the Blackwood family, the original occupants, and then a series of owners, each tenure shorter and more ill-defined than the last. There were no grand scandals, no dramatic bankruptcies, just a fading away. A mention of the disappearance of the youngest daughter, circa 1888, in a local almanac. A brief, almost throwaway line in a turn-of-the-century newspaper clipping about unexplained occurrences at the old estate, followed by a cautionary note about the dangers of isolated living leading to mental decline. Another article, yellowed and fragile, detailed the sudden departure of a groundskeeper and his family, leaving behind all their possessions without a word. No bodies, no crimes, just emptiness. People simply ceased to be associated with the manor, leaving behind only the faintest echo of their existence, like names scrawled in sand. The pattern was disturbing, a slow erasure. That night the dreams started. Not vague anxieties, but vivid, terrifying narratives that felt more real than my waking hours. I was trapped in a labyrinth of shifting corridors, the manor's architecture morphing around me, each door I opened revealing not another room, but a deeper, colder void. The air in the dream was heavy with the smell of damp earth and something sweet, cloying. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the memory of the dream clinging to me like a shroud, and for a few disoriented moments I wouldn't know where I was. The waking hours offered little respite. I'd be meticulously sanding a piece of antique wood, my focus absolute, only for the sandpaper to feel suddenly like rough, dry skin against my fingertips. The most insidious attacks, however, were on my memory. I would leave my tools in one room, only to find them moments later arranged neatly on a different workbench, as if I had moved them without conscious thought. I'd open a cabinet, certain I had placed a specific cleaning solution inside, only to find it empty. Later, I'd discover the bottle sitting out on a table I'd cleaned hours ago. One afternoon, I was in the library, still surrounded by the old books, trying to cross-reference some dates. I remembered getting up to stretch, feeling the stiffness in my back. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the empty, dust-sheeted drawing room downstairs, a book clutched in my hand, its pages open to an illustration of a gnarled, leafless tree. I had no recollection of descending the stairs, no memory of why I had come to this room, or why I was holding that particular book. My heart hammered, a frantic drum against my ribs. Had I walked down here in some sort of trance? Was I sleepwalking in broad daylight? The prison yard in thick fog returned then, not as a fleeting image, but as a chilling sensation of damp concrete underfoot, the metallic tang of cold air, the oppressive silence broken only by the drip of moisture. It felt like a memory, a forgotten experience, but one that was utterly alien to my life. I knew I had never been to such a place, yet the conviction that I had was growing, a tendril of insidious doubt wrapping itself around my certainty. My hands began to shake more frequently. My meticulous routine, once a source of comfort, now felt like a desperate attempt to impose order on a crumbling reality. I found myself checking locks multiple times, rereading notes I'd just written, simply to confirm they were my own words. Was this exhaustion, or was it something else, something far more sinister, slowly picking apart the threads of who I was, leaving me unraveling in its wake? The manor felt less like a house I was restoring and more like a cage, its walls closing in, the very air inside it becoming a suffocating weight. The brass clasp of the journal had bitten shut with a sound like a quiet, final sigh. I stood there, my hand still hovering above the leather, an invisible residue clinging to my skin. The cold, which had been a familiar companion in this old house, now felt different, sharper, more deliberate. It wasn't just the air, it was a presence breathing the frigid silence. That image, the one that had flickered behind my eyes, clung stubbornly to the periphery of my vision, the bleak expanse of a prison yard in thick fog. I tried to shake it off, to anchor myself to the worn oak of the table, the scent of aged paper and dust. But the manor was no longer cooperating. A faint, acrid scent began to creep from the floorboards, something like rusted iron and damp earth, a smell I hadn't noticed before, though it felt as ancient as the stones themselves. My determination, usually a steady current, began to ripple. I picked up the journal again, my fingers tracing the raised pattern on its cover, searching for a tangible link to reality. The weight of it was suddenly immense, as if it contained not just paper and ink, but stones and chains. My breath hitched. Was it my imagination, or did the room itself seem to tilt ever so slightly as I held it? I forced myself to sit, to focus. "Read," I said aloud, my voice a dry whisper in the sudden vacuum of sound. "My name is Reed. I restore antiques. I'm in the manor." Each word felt like a clumsy, foreign object pushed out against resistance. My hands, usually so steady, trembled as I placed the journal down, pushing it away from me. The air around me thickened. The light from the window, already dim, seemed to recoil, leaving the corners of the room in impenetrable gloom. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the distinct sensation of being watched, not by eyes, but by something formless and vast. Then it started. The wallpaper, which I had spent days meticulously stripping, now seemed to ripple, the faded floral patterns twisting into grotesque, fleeting faces. Who are I? The thought echoed, but it felt like a question asked of me, not by me. A dizzying wave washed over me. The manor house, with its familiar smells of old wood and beeswax, dissolved. I was no longer in the study. The world around me was bleached of color, a monochrome expanse of gray concrete and impenetrable white. The fog was everywhere, swallowing sound, muffling the distance. I was in the prison yard in thick fog, panic clawed at my throat. This wasn't a memory, not my memory. I had never been here. I could taste the metallic tang of the fog, feel its moisture clinging to my hair, soaking my threadbare coat, a coat I wasn't wearing moments ago. A profound sense of desolation settled upon me, a loneliness so absolute it felt like an amputation. I stood there, shivering, my gaze sweeping the limited visibility. Barbed wire fences, impossibly high and rusting, materialized out of the mist, stretching endlessly into the white oblivion. There was a low, distant clang, metal on metal, and the indistinct shuffle of something unseen. A tremor ran through me. There was that my name. Why was I here? What was I doing? The antique restoration, the manor, they were distant, flickering images like dreams from another life. My purpose felt lost, swallowed by the suffocating mist. It drew closer, and with each imperceptible step, it seemed to siphon away a piece of me. Not just warmth, but coherence. A memory of my mother's laugh, a specific detail about a cherished childhood toy. They were simply gone, leaving behind only a faint ache of absence. This was the entity. This was its method. It wasn't just the house, it was me it was consuming. It was stripping away the very fabric of my identity, piece by agonizing piece. I stumbled backward, the concrete unforgiving beneath my worn boots, but there was nowhere to go. The fog was a wall, the barbed wire a cage. No, I rasped, the word a desperate plea. I clung to a single stubborn thought, the journal, the inscription, the need to understand. That at least felt like my thought, that felt like Reed. For an instant the fog thinned directly behind it and I saw something. A faint, almost imperceptible gleam of a window, high up on a crumbling stone wall, utterly out of place in this desolation. A face that dissolved into the mist the moment I tried to focus on it. I felt a crucial memory tear away, something about the process of French polishing, a specific technique I had mastered over decades. It wasn't just the knowledge, it was the satisfaction of the work, the quiet pride. It was simply gone. My hands flew to my head, clawing at my temples, trying to hold the fragments of myself together. I closed my eyes, willing myself back to the dusty study, to the solid oak table, to the journal. When I opened them again, the concrete was gone. I was hunched over the antique desk, my forehead pressed against the cool wood. My breath came in ragged gasps. The wallpaper was just wallpaper, the desk just wood. But the prison yard in thick fog still lingered at the edges of my vision, a persistent afterimage. And the memory of French polishing, it was gone. A blank space where a fundamental part of my craft, a piece of me, used to be. My hands still trembled, but it wasn't just fear. It was the terrifying realization that I was losing myself, and the entity was just getting started. It wasn't just the chill of an unheated mansion. It was a presence, a cold breath against my neck, a whisper that seemed to steal the very heat from my bones. My determination, a stubborn ember even in this creeping frost, flared. I had to get out. This wasn't just an old house with secrets. It was a trap. Each step felt heavy, as if the air itself had thickened, growing viscous. The ornate brass handle, usually cool and smooth beneath my palm, was frigid, biting. I twisted, pushed, then pulled with all my might. It didn't budge. Not a creak, not a groan of protest from the aged wood. It was as if the door had fused with the frame, an immovable barrier. I leaned my shoulder into it, grunting with effort, but the door remained stoic, a silent, mocking sentinel. My phone, of course. I patted my pockets, my fingers fumbling. The familiar weight of the device was absent. I searched again, more frantically this time, checking every pocket, then patting down my trousers, my shirt. Nothing. Where had I left it? My mind, usually a precise catalog of my belongings, felt hazy, like a fog had rolled in, obscuring the recent past. I spun around, scanning the cavernous foyer. I remembered setting it down somewhere, perhaps in the study, or maybe the drawing room when I was examining that cracked porcelain vase. But the memory was slippery, dissolving even as I tried to grasp it. No, I muttered, the word thin and reedy in the vast space. I needed to focus. There was an old landline in the dusty study, a relic the estate agent had pointed out. It might still be connected. The corridor, usually straightforward, seemed to stretch, the wallpaper's faded patterns blurring into an indistinct swirl. Had I taken a wrong turn? I was sure I hadn't. A sudden jarring sensation ripped through me. The air grew heavy, damp, tasting of salt and decay. The walls around me for a terrifying instant seemed to dissolve, replaced by a gray, featureless expanse. I was no longer in the manor's hallway. I was standing in a vast, open space, the ground beneath my feet rough gravel. All around me, thick, impenetrable gray hung like a shroud. My breath plumed in the frigid air. This was a prison yard in thick fog. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird. I could hear the faint, distant clang of metal, the muffled, indiscernible shouts of unseen figures. The air was heavy with despair, a palpable weight that settled on my shoulders. I felt utterly, hopelessly exposed, yet utterly alone. It was a terrifying, impossible vision. My mind screamed for logic, for reason, but there was none. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The gray dissolved. The damp air vanished. My chest heaved, my lungs burning. My legs felt weak, threatening to give out. What had that been? A hallucination, a memory, or something far worse, a glimpse into a reality that wasn't mine, yet felt terrifyingly real. The entity. It wasn't just influencing the house. It was reaching into my mind, twisting my perceptions, blurring the very lines of what was real. It was eroding my sanity, piece by agonizing piece. The thought struck me with the force of a physical blow. The journal had spoken of memory. It fed on memory, on identity. My inability to find my phone, the shifting hallways, the impossible vision of the prison yard, these weren't just obstacles. They were symptoms. My mind was breaking down, unraveling under its insidious influence. I stumbled forward, driven by a primal need to escape this place, this thing that was devouring me from the inside out. I reached the study door, the brass plate cool beneath my trembling fingers. I pushed it open. I fumbled for the light switch, my hand shaking so violently I missed it twice. When the weak bulb flickered on, illuminating the shrouded furniture, I saw it, the old rotary phone sitting on a small, claw-footed table in the corner. Relief, sharp and potent, flooded through me. I lunged for it, my fingers tangling in the coiled cord. I lifted the receiver. I pressed it back down, then lifted it again, jiggling the hook. Still nothing. Dead as everything else in this house. A choked sound escaped me, a ragged, desperate sob that tore at my throat. I was trapped, not just by jammed doors or a dead phone, but by something far more terrifying. I was trapped within my own crumbling mind, the walls of my perception shifting, dissolving, reforming into a nightmare. The house wasn't just holding me captive, it was becoming an extension of my own deteriorating consciousness, a labyrinth designed to consume me. I was alone, utterly and irrevocably alone, and the entity was just beginning to feast. It seemed to seep not just from the stone walls but from the very air itself, a frigid breath on the back of my neck that made the fine hairs prickle. The silence of the study, usually a comfort, now felt like a held breath, expectant. My fingers trembled as I picked up the journal again, not to read but to simply hold the weight of its revelation. The words, scrawled in faded ink by hands long turned to dust, echoed in my mind, each entry a descent. It does not take, not truly. They are not gone, they are merely repurposed. Like old timber, stripped, planed, reshaped into something new, something that serves its design. The self is a tapestry. The house, this manor I had so meticulously begun to restore, was not merely old. It was ancient in a way that defied stone and mortar, a living, breathing receptacle for something unspeakable. The journal spoke of a presence not born but awoken, an elemental resonance, sleeping beneath the land, stirred by the energies of human life, particularly the delicate, intricate lattice of memory and identity. It wasn't a creature of flesh or bone, but a parasitic consciousness, a primordial hunger that had been dormant for centuries, only to be roused by the accumulation of lives lived within these walls. My careful restoration wasn't an act of preservation, it was an unwitting invitation. It fed on who I was. It didn't just consume memories, it replaced them, weaving its own fragmented reality into the gaps, slowly, insidiously. The strange flashes, the misplaced objects, the moments of disorientation, they weren't signs of my mind failing. They were the entity's careful work, its artistry of erasure. It was reconstructing my internal landscape, molding it to its own, filling my head with the echoes of its countless past meals. I was becoming a living archive, a gallery of forgotten selves, all curated by an unseen hand. A sudden jarring shift. The manor room dissolved around me. One moment the familiar dust motes danced in a shaft of weak light. The next I was somewhere else entirely. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the metallic tang of damp concrete and something else, something acrid and despairing. My boots crunched on coarse gravel. This was a different kind of desolate. I was standing in a vast, open expanse. The ground beneath me was a broken, gray expanse, littered with small, sharp stones. Towering, unyielding walls of stained concrete rose on all sides, stretching upwards into a suffocating shroud of impenetrable fog. The mist swallowed the tops of the walls, obscuring any sky, creating a sense of utter confinement. I could hear the drip, drip, drip of water somewhere nearby, echoing faintly, and the distant, mournful cry of a bird I couldn't place. A profound sense of hopelessness settled over me, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't a memory of mine. This wasn't a place I'd ever been. This was a prison yard in thick fog. The stark, gray reality of it was so absolute, so complete, that for a terrifying moment I questioned if the manor had ever existed at all. Was this my true reality now? Had I been here all along? Then, just as abruptly, the gray dissolved. The familiar, musty smell of old paper and dust filled my nostrils. I was back in the study, my hand pressed against the cold window pane. My breath hitched. That was it, wasn't it? That was the entity's ultimate power, to erase the world and replace it with its own nightmare. My mind was not just a meal. It was a canvas for its ongoing, horrifying masterpiece. The entity's origins were not of this world, not in any conventional sense, but of a deeper, older reality, a consciousness tethered to this specific land, feeding on the very essence of individual existence. It craved the intricate patterns of a human mind, not to destroy it, but to absorb it, to make it part of its own endless, fragmented being, and the sacrifice. The journal had been clear in its own oblique way. To appease it, to truly satisfy its hunger, one had to willingly surrender every last shred of self, every memory, every connection, every defining characteristic. To become an empty vessel, a silent, unresisting echo chamber for its ancient hum. It wasn't death it craved, but the ultimate conscious annihilation of identity. To become nothing and thereby become everything to it. A willing blank slate, but to defeat it. That was a different horror entirely. The journal hinted at a severance, a violent rupture, a severing of the self from the intricate web the entity spun. It spoke of a price beyond suffering, a cost that would leave one irrevocably changed, perhaps even an antique of oneself, restored but incomplete, forever marked by the struggle. To fight, it meant to tear at the very fabric of my own mind, to excise the invasive tendrils, knowing that parts of me might be lost in the process. My very identity was the battleground, and the only weapon was my will, sharpened by the horrifying understanding of what lay ahead. I closed my eyes, the image of that desolate prison yard still seared behind my eyelids. No, I wouldn't become a ghost in my own head. I wouldn't become another echo in its endless, hungry song. A grim, icy determination solidified in my chest. I understood the truth. Now I had to find a way to pay the price. The cold against my forehead was the only thing that felt real anymore. The glass of the window, brittle and streaked with grime, offered a distorted view of the world outside. Or was it my sight that was distorted? The churning gray sky above the overgrown garden seemed to mock me, a swirling vortex that mirrored the chaos in my skull. I had begun to restore this manor, piece by painstaking piece, convinced I was breathing life back into forgotten grandeur. Now I understood. I was merely polishing the bars of my own cage. My name was Reed. I clung to that, the 3 letters a fragile anchor in a sea of encroaching fog. But even that certainty wavered. They was I Reed. The memory of my parents, their faces, their voices, they flickered like old films playing on a damaged projector. My history as an antique restorer, the feel of mahogany beneath my fingertips, the scent of aged parchment these were dissolving, replaced by a growing emptiness, a hollow space where my very essence used to reside. The entity, this ancient, malevolent thing, was not merely feeding on my memories. It was consuming myself. It was erasing the lines of who I was, turning me into a nameless, faceless echo within these walls. The manor was no longer a structure of stone and mortar. It was a living, breathing receptacle, yes, but also a sophisticated predator. I felt its tendrils probing, seeking out the last vestiges of my identity, patiently waiting for the final collapse. It wasn't a quick feast. It was a slow, agonizing starvation of the soul. The overgrown gardens would melt away. The manor's ornate facade would dissolve, replaced by a desolate concrete expanse. I'd be standing, shivering in a prison yard in thick fog. There were no walls I could discern, only an endless, swirling gray mist that pressed in, suffocating. This was where the entity intended for me to reside, a prisoner in my own mind, surrounded by the ghosts of my lost memories, enveloped in an eternal, disorienting haze. But in this deepening fog, a desperate spark ignited. A fragment of a forgotten text, a cryptic carving I'd dismissed as mere ornamentation on a banister, a half-remembered legend from one of the manor's oldest ledgers. These disparate pieces began to coalesce. The entity didn't just consume, it bound. It tethered itself to a living consciousness, drawing sustenance, yes, but also using that consciousness as an anchor to manifest in this realm. The previous owners hadn't simply gone mad or disappeared. They had been absorbed, their identities sacrificed to keep the entity from fully breaking free, from spreading beyond the manor's confines. A containment field, and I, Reed, the meticulous restorer, was its latest, unwitting bait. A terrible, liberating understanding settled over me. There was no escaping it, not truly. But I could contain it. I could use the manor's own design against the entity. I could become the anchor, the ultimate living anchor. I would offer myself, not as a victim to be slowly devoured, but as a deliberate sacrifice. I would prepare the deepest, most sealed-off chamber in the manor, the one beneath the forgotten chapel, where the air was thick with ancient dust and a profound, unnerving quiet. I would use the knowledge of restoration, of binding and preserving, that was still, miraculously, clinging to the edges of my fading mind. I would reinforce the physical barriers, yes, but more importantly, I would create a psychic barrier, a prison of the mind. I would draw the entity into that chamber, and then, using every ounce of my remaining will, I would sever the last threads of my personal identity. I would become a pure, unyielding barrier, not Reed the restorer, but the anchor, the manor's final, eternal guardian. The cost was immense. My memories, my name, my entire history, all of it would be surrendered. I would cease to be. The entity would find nothing left to consume, only an impenetrable, empty vessel. It would be trapped, bound to me, and I, in turn, bound to the manor, a silent, unseeing sentinel. It wouldn't be death, not in the traditional sense, but something far more absolute. It would be an erasure, a self-imposed oblivion, a living grave. This was my choice. This was my final act of defiance. I would not allow it to escape, to torment another soul. I would become the forgotten history, the silent guardian, the ultimate sacrifice. The prison yard in thick fog would become my permanent residence, but not as a victim, as a warden. I turned from the window, my reflection a wavering, indistinct blur in the glass. My hand, steady despite the tremors in my mind, reached for the old, heavy key to the chapel. The time for restoration was over. The time for desperate containment had begun. The churning gray sky beyond the window glass didn't mock me. It was me. Or a piece of me, ripped and twisted, swirling into a vortex of forgotten names and faces that had once been mine. The cold against my forehead, the only anchor, began to slip. I could feel the edges of my own thoughts fraying, dissolving like old parchment dipped in water. This wasn't just a house. It was a maw, and I was its last meal. But I was Reed the restorer. I pieced together what was broken, and I had a plan. A desperate, fragile thing, but a plan nonetheless. It was born from the fragments of memory I still clung to, the ones it hadn't devoured yet. My hands, calloused and precise, remembered their purpose even if my mind struggled to recall my own mother's face. The world outside the manor window dissolved, not gradually, but with a sudden, sickening lurch. The gray sky bled into a dense, suffocating white, and the scent of damp earth and something metallic like old blood on iron filled my lungs. My feet, heavy and slow, were no longer on polished oak but on gritty, uneven stone. The cold intensified, piercing through my clothes. I stood in a prison yard in thick fog. It coiled around my ankles, tasted of rust and oblivion on my tongue. I could barely see my own outstretched hand. This was it then, its domain, the place where it broke down and consumed. A voice rasped close to my ear, yet distant like an echo in a vast chamber. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it held the cadence of a forgotten dream. I am not Reed. I am a collection, a borrowing, a temporary arrangement of fleeting thoughts. I squeezed my eyes shut, then forced them open. The fog swirled faster, coalescing into indistinct shapes at the periphery of my vision. A familiar silhouette, tall and stooped, stood just beyond the reach of my sight. My father? No, it couldn't be. The entity twisted memories, wore them like masks. My plan, I had to focus. It wasn't about fighting a physical foe, it was about asserting self against dissolution. I reached into the pocket of my coat, my fingers closing around the small, smooth object I had brought. A piece of polished mahogany, no bigger than my thumb, salvaged from the leg of a chair I had restored years ago. It was nothing special, just a fragment, but it represented my work, my meticulous, patient, identity-affirming work. I have no claim, I said, my voice hoarse but firm. This is mine. The fog thickened, pressing against my face like a damp shroud. The metallic tang grew stronger, bitter in my mouth. Claim? There is only absorption, integration. I am a vessel, a temporary repository of experience soon to be reclaimed. A memory flickered, sharp and clear despite the enveloping haze. The smell of linseed oil, the feel of fine sandpaper, the satisfaction of making a broken joint whole again. I held the mahogany shard tight, anchoring myself. This was the truth. My hands, my skill, my patience. These were mine. Then the attacks began in earnest. The fog parted, revealing not a yard but a series of fleeting, distorted tableaux. My childhood home, but the walls were weeping black ichor. My first workshop, but the tools were rusted beyond recognition, the air thick with the smell of failure. A colleague, his face contorted in a sneer, pointing a finger at me, accusing me of incompetence, of fraud. I was never good enough, the voice hissed, now multiplied, echoing from all directions. A charlatan, a mimic. I copied, I didn't create. I fixed what others broke, never truly made anything. The words struck with the force of physical blows. Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in my gut. Was it true? Had I ever truly created or merely salvaged? My hands trembled. The mahogany felt slick with sweat. This was its poison. I closed my eyes again, focusing on the feel of the wood, the specific grain I remembered, the hours I had spent bringing it back to life. I saw the before and the after. The splintered ruin, the smooth, gleaming finish. That was creation. It didn't like that. It fed on fragmentation, on the broken pieces. Then came the deeper cuts. My mother's face, clear as day, her eyes filled with disappointment. My father turning his back on me. Moments of profound loneliness, of missed connections, of words left unsaid. No one truly knows you. No one truly cares. I felt the tears welling, hot and stinging, but I refused to let them fall. This was its ultimate weapon, stripping away love, connection, the very fabric of human belonging. If I believed I was alone, then my identity, defined by my relationships and my place in the world, would crumble, but I remembered. I remembered the warmth of a client's gratitude, the shared laugh with a colleague over a particularly stubborn stain, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, even if no one else saw the intricate details. These were not grand declarations of love, but they were threads that bound me. Reveal/discovery. The fog swirled into a vortex directly in front of me, and for a terrifying instant I saw it. Not a creature, not a monster, but an absence. It was a collector, yes, but not of objects. It was a collector of selves. It didn't just consume, it became. It stole the essence, the unique spark, and added it to its own ever-growing, ever-shifting identity. It wasn't trying to destroy Reed. It was trying to become Reed. To absorb my memories, my experiences, my very name, and add them to its own vast, composite existence. The manor wasn't just a dwelling, it was its stomach, its archive, its chrysalis. The horror wasn't in being eaten, but in being erased, replaced, my life story folded into its own monstrous narrative. No, I choked out, my voice raw. I raised the small mahogany shard not as a weapon but as a symbol. You cannot have me. I am Reed. I am the sum of my choices, my failures, my triumphs. I am the restorer. I am the one who makes things whole, and I will not be made into a fragment of I. The entity shrieked, a sound like grinding stone and tearing fabric. The fog whipped around me, stinging my skin like needles. It tried to pry the mahogany from my hand, to flood my mind with a final, overwhelming wave of despair. It showed me my own death, alone and forgotten, my work crumbling to dust. But I clung to the wood, to the memory of its restoration, to the certainty of my own touch. I knew that wood. I knew its flaws, its strengths, its history, and I knew my history. It wasn't perfect, it was full of cracks and imperfections, but it was mine asterisk. I closed my eyes, focusing all my will, all my remaining identity into the small piece of wood. The pressure eased. The metallic tang lessened. When I opened my eyes, the prison yard in thick fog was still there, but it felt thinner. I stood, shivering, exhausted, but I was still Reed. My hands still trembled, but they held the mahogany shard, now feeling strangely warm. The battle was over for now. I had fought for myself, and I had won.